Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we're going to touch upon a rather spicy topic, a somewhat heretical topic, a radical topic, if you wish. Namely, chaos, and whether or not it can be used, whether or not it is inherently evil, and whether or not chaos could be used to destroy chaos. And as examples for this, we will be looking at two Space Marine, or, if you wish, Chaos Space Marine chapters, the Relictors and the Blood Gorgons. But before that, I am going to quickly talk about Chaos again, so we're all on the same page. Now, I would suggest you go and watch my 40k explained Chaos lore, the Warp and its influence video, as it will be far more in-depth. But if you can't be bothered, then I'll explain it briefly here. The power we know as Chaos can also be described as the Immaterium, or the Warp. The Warp is a second universe that exists alongside our universe. Generally speaking, I might refer to Chaos and the Warp as the Immaterium, while our world would be the Material universe. What is important to note is, Chaos cannot exist without us. The Immaterium cannot exist without the Material universe, as it is us in the Material universe, our thoughts, our feelings, and our emotions that create the Immaterium. It is the sentient beings of the galaxy, their hatred, their anger, and their need to shed the blood of their enemies that creates Khorne. It is the fact that practically all of them grow old and die and grow sick that creates Nurgle. It is the fact that all of them seek change, that all of them change their political system, their biology, their very form of evolution that creates Tzeentch, and it is their excess of emotion and debauchery of certain civilized species, Eldar, that creates Slaanesh. However, these beings also have a basic understanding of their existence. Now, the understanding varies greatly on their own powers. For example, a lesser demon has very little in the way of intelligence. A greater demon might have a base level of intelligence based upon its needs and ideas. For example, a Bloodletter of Khorne might have a certain low cunning that might help it to shed the blood of its enemies, and come up with schemes to enter into the material realm, whilst a Fate Weaver of Tzeentch might have a grand intelligence for coming up with plots, but he might not necessarily be as intelligent in other areas. For example, he might have no understanding of basic math, but he might be perfectly able to orchestrate grand schemes of plots and intrigues that could drag entire planets into chaos and warfare. And of course, when it comes to the gods themselves, we simply cannot understand their intellect. They function on a plane so completely and utterly alien to us that it would be like an ant trying to understand the mind of a man, and why the man might step on it. However, there is one basic necessity that all of these creatures have in common, and that is the need for them to be believed in. The need for their most basic fundamental aspects to be understood, to be believed in, and to be carried out. For example, in the case of Khorne, his most fundamental aspect is hatred, anger, and bloodshed. As such, he will, on a fundamental level, always seek to increase the amount of hate, anger, and bloodshed in the galaxy, and thusly all of his servants will try to do the same. And of course, the amount of anger, hatred, and bloodshed in the galaxy is also directly proportional to how powerful these entities are, and how much they can affect the material world. This is the reason why, if the Emperor's Crusade was successful and essentially managed to eradicate superstition and religion, this would essentially be as good as killing the Chaos Gods. They would still exist. Chaos would still exist in a baby form. Khorne would still exist because they would still be bloodshed. They would still be anger, and they would still be hatred, but none of these emotions would be attributed to a greater entity, a god, a being in the warp. and as such, Khorne would only gain a minuscule percentage of the power he would actually gain if the bloodshed was carried out in his name, or in the name of one of his many proxy entities. For example, let's take something from our history. Mars, the Roman god of war, could be considered an aspect of Khorne, because he is the god of war. And practically every single civilization in the galaxy has some form of a god of war. And only through extremely precise understanding and manipulation of the warp can that entity be made separate from Khorne. This level of manipulation is beyond virtually all species, and the only ones that have been able to truly do so are a few races created by the Old Ones. For example, the Eldar have created Kaela Menshur Cain, their bloody-handed god of war, whom is not an aspect of Khorne, regardless of what some silly-willy writers might try to tell you. And by that very same coin, Gork and Mork, the gods of the Greenskins, also obviously gods of war, are not aspects of Khorne, because these have been created by races that the Old Ones themselves made. In the case of the Eldar, they have a deep-set understanding of warp and chaos. In the case of the Orcs, they have an instinctual understanding of the gods of chaos and the warp. In other words, at the end of the day, as much as the warp and the materium feeds on our material world, they also exist entirely at the mercy of the material world. And so, with that brief explanation, and yes, I know that was basically 7 minutes of explanation, but considering the proper explanation is a good 30 minutes, I still would consider that brief. Now, let's return to the questions, shall we? Let's begin with the question, is chaos inherently evil? And as the example for this, we will be using the Blood Gorgons. Now, the Gorgons are most definitively a renegade chapter, and in fact, you could probably say they're outright a chaos chapter at this point, yet the blanket qualification of evil does not necessarily apply to them. The Blood Gorgons was founded during the 21st founding, yes, that founding, and as such you can pretty much already understand why they decided to turn renegade. And in the case of the Blood Gorgons, they were clearly the subject of some form of mental experiment, as the Blood Gorgons are rather unique amongst Astartes, in that rather than clearly being fully indoctrinated into the imperial belief system and values, etc., they seem to value their individual freedoms above anything else. They go so far as to consider any form of subjugation to any kind of external force to be a defeat, a shameful action, and something they would rather die than subject themselves to. However, at the same time, they also see the benefit of structure. They are not cornered berserkers that simply ravage across the galaxy with no aim, goal, or reason. They simply don't like to subjugate themselves to any sort of command structure that isn't their own command structure. You could perhaps say that they're essentially superpowered ANCAPs in space. And this independent streak, of course, meant that they didn't get along particularly well with the Imperium. For about 600 years or so, they kind of humoured the Imperium, but mostly kept to themselves. They would wander across their assigned area of space in a fleet, and kind of try to avoid as much contact with the wider Imperium as humanly possible. This, however, became kind of impossible, as the wider Imperium started to suspect that maybe, just maybe, the Blood Gorgons were being a little bit too independent. Imperial governors would request the aid of the Blood Gorgons, and they would either A, not respond, or B, say, not my planet, not my problem. This eventually led, rather unavoidably, to the Blood Gorgons receiving the strictest censor, and eventually being deemed excommunicatis traitores, and the Space Wolves were sent to chastise them in the most severe fashion possible. The Blood Gorgons almost ceased to exist as a chapter at the hands of their lupine hunters. However, being good little renegades, they fled into the Immaterium, where they spent several decades essentially existing as a form of forager, hunter-gatherer tribe. They would attack unprotected shipping or poorly defended Imperial outposts, or indeed anything they could get their hands on, where they would steal ammunition, food, and other necessities of simply staying alive. The once proud chapter had been reduced to little more than thieves and raiders. Eventually, however, they were given a boon, presumably by certain chaotic entities, and they found a new home aboard the space hulk, the Cauldron Born. At this point, the Blood Gorgons had turned to the worship of the Chaos Gods, not through any wish of their own, and not in any way subjugating themselves to the Chaos Gods. Instead, they simply decided to utilize the forces of chaos for their own ends. As far as the Blood Gorgons were concerned, merely worshipping chaos in its entirety was not the same as subjugating themselves to chaos. They would use whatever boons the Chaos Gods saw fit in granting them, and they would use the artifacts, and even potentially the creatures of chaos, but they would not be used in turn by the forces of chaos. A state of mind that, whilst the Blood Gorgon might wish to retain it, I am thinking that the Chaos Gods might take an issue with that particular line of thinking sooner or later. Anyways, having found the Cauldron Born, the Blood Gorgons were finally freed from the basic necessities of surviving. They could once again try to organize as a chapter and begin restoring some of their chapter's strength. But this is where a small problem became apparent. As mentioned, the Blood Gorgons are fiercely independent, and whilst they had been forced to work together because otherwise they would simply die, now there was a bit of an issue, because everyone seemed to have an idea of where the chapter was going to go from here. Some advocated complete subjugation to the force of chaos. Some argued for the complete abolishment of any and all ties to the chaotic powers, stating that even if it was not a subjugation yet, a deal with the devil will always end in subjugation, regardless of the intent of the mere mortals. Others argued that the chapter should spread itself across the galaxy and essentially disband as a single fighting force, and let the individual warbands go where they wished. This internal strife led to the Blood Gorgons splitting into several rivaling warlords, who would carve out their own little pieces of the Cauldron Born and fortify it against their now rival brethren. They would launch raids upon one another, and they were essentially in a state of civil war for a considerable period of time. The already depleted chapter was yet further depleted by this period of internal conflict. After a long and bloody civil war, leaving much of the Space Hulk in ruins, and a considerable portion of the Blood Gorgons dead on said ruin, the war was finally won by Gamadine, who took upon himself the title of Corsad, de facto chapter master of what remained of the Blood Gorgons. He introduced a new ritual to the Gorgons, known as the Blood Bonding. This was a heretical little ritual, where two Astartes would pledge brotherhood to one another, rather than the chapter or any overreaching authority, and certainly no Chaos God. The ritual itself, however, is at the very least partially chaotic in origins. The two Bond brothers would share their flesh, their blood, and their very essence with each other. This essence would then be bound together by the Chirurgon Vicious of the Blood Gorgons. These are heretical sorcerer apothecaries that mix both the hallowed traditions of the apothecarians and the healing of wounds and the retrieval of gene seed with the heretical rituals of chaos sorcery. The result of this blood binding is that 1 essentially becomes 2, and 2 becomes a 1. Both brothers gain an instinctual understanding of the other, and they can much more effectively support each other on the battlefield, as if they can read each other's mind. And at least in part, they also inhabit the same astral body. This is a concept of the warp. Psykers may have an astral form. This astral form may receive wounds, and those wounds will affect the real body. The blood binding seems to have a form of lower aspect of this astral form, where if one brother is wounded, the other brother might actually feel the pain of that wound. Now, there is of course a few problems with this. This of course means that on a fundamental level, every single Blood Gorgon is now, even if they don't think so themselves, a pawn of chaos. Chaos is worked into the very essence of their being. And you can bet your lily-white ass that if the Sergan witches are ever feeling threatened by the rest of the Gorgons, they've probably worked in a failsafe or two. And additionally, this represents a rather severe split within the Blood Gorgons. Their vaunted brotherhood may stretch between individuals, between pairs of brethren, and through those bonds might even stretch to a certain degree to the wider organization. However, they are clearly at odds with the Sergan witches, who are not themselves blood-bonded, and they, of course, are chaos sorcerers. They are de facto servants of the chaos gods. They have committed themselves to servitude, the very thing the Blood Gorgons consider to be the most vile and base of conduct. The Blood Gorgons may be united for now, but I doubt they will stay that way. However, now that I've told you about the Blood Gorgons, I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. In the case of the Blood Gorgons, chaos is not a force for pure evil. The Blood Gorgons are not raiding settlements and destroying them because they're evil. They're not even doing it in the name of the Chaos Gods. They are doing it for their own survival. In fact, a charitable description would be to say that they are doing it for their own independence. And after all, it would be very difficult for anyone to argue that the Imperium is a bastion of freedom or independence in any way, shape, or form. In fact, if it was not for the more heretical rituals of the Blood Gorgons, one might even go so far as to say that the Blood Gorgons were correct in rising up against the Imperium in the names of their own freedoms. However, that is of course where the problem comes in. The ritual of blood binding is clearly heretical, and works the very essence of chaos into their own flesh. They also have several, shall we say, unliberal practices. They place their own freedom above that of anyone else, and by extension they do not give two tossers about the freedoms of anyone that is not a bonded brother or a Blood Gorgon. As such, their armies are primarily made up of slaves. Every pair of bonded blood brothers have their own retinues of enslaved thralls. These are helmet bearers, dancers, musicians, cooks, soldiers, and servants of every stripe. The Blood Gorgons are not the good guys we are looking for. They may care for their own freedoms, but not for anybody else's. Additionally, as with so many chaos rituals, the ritual of blood binding requires certain sacrifices. Additionally, many of the new traditions of the Blood Gorgons have a rather dark and bloody twist to them, because the services of the Chaos Gods never come freely. Their gifts and their blessings always comes with certain conditions. And as such, the Blood Gorgons have had to adopt rather unfortunate habits. As such, blood sacrifice has become rather common within the Blood Gorgons. So to answer the first question, is chaos inherently evil? Well, the word evil, of course, is one that inherently has no meaning. It is all based upon the inherent morality of the person using it. But I think it fairly safe to say that based upon most modern morality, and indeed even Imperial 40k morality, blood sacrifice in the service of the Dark Gods is probably evil. But that does not actually mean that chaos is inherently evil. This is where we need to delve into a little bit more nuance in this question, but before that, an always beloved mid-roll ad. After all, we are talking about evil here, so I really couldn't help myself now, could I? And now that you have seen the true face of evil, let us return to our discussion. So, chaos can be both inherently evil and not inherently evil at the same time. It depends on which portion of chaos you are looking at, because at its very most basic elements, chaos is but an elemental force. A hurricane is not evil, despite it killing and harming hundreds of people. An earthquake is not evil, despite the fact that it would do just as much damage, if not more. However, if these natural disasters were ever caused with intent to cause harm, that, arguably, would be an action of evil. And this is where the four main chaos gods come into the picture: Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle, and Tzeentch. These four are inherently evil because of how they gain their power. They gain their power based upon these base negative emotions, and the more extreme an emotion is, the more power they gain. And since their only goal in life is to acquire more power, naturally, they will automatically seek out the most extreme form of emotion they can possibly induce. Let us take Slaanesh as an example. There is an argument made by Slaaneshi followers that goes something like this. Slaanesh is not an evil god. In fact, he's a benevolent god. After all he asks of you is that you take more pleasure from the food you eat, the air you breathe, and the companions you spend your time with. All Slaanesh asks is that you enjoy every moment of your life to the fullest. How could that possibly be evil? And therein lies the lie. The Chaos Gods love to deceive, not necessarily by deception, or even necessarily by pure trickery, but by a mix. They lie through omission. Slaanesh does indeed ask that you take pleasure from the food you eat, but he also asks you to take more pleasure from the food you eat. And he will constantly urge you to do so. You might eat a fine steak and think, this is tasty, this is good, I am enjoying this. And Slaanesh will gain a minuscule amount of power from those emotions, but he will wish you to drive further into this, and to do so, he will begin taking away that pleasure. He will start whispering in your ear, okay, this is fine, but maybe, just maybe, there is something even better for you to eat, somewhere out there. And this thought will then gnaw into your very soul, into your mind, until you are entirely certain that whilst this steak might be good, there is something better out there. And slowly but surely, once you think of that more and more and more, the steak will start to lose a lot of its flavour. Because remember, the grass is always greener on the other side. And so, step, by careful, minuscule step, Slaanesh will push the poor bastard to take one more step into damnation. Just one more. Think of the pleasures, think of the greater excess you will enjoy if you just take one more step. And then, before you know it, you're eating people. And when that's no longer enough, you have to eat people after you've tortured them. And when that's no longer enough, you have to eat people after you've tortured them, after you've tortured their families in front of them, and so on, and so on, and so on. The Chaos Gods wish for extreme emotions and extreme actions because that is what gives them the greatest amount of power. Another example would be Nurgle. Now, Nurgle might be perfectly content on simply just letting the wheels of time grind on. People would become old, they would rot away, and they would die. But that would only give him a minuscule amount of power. Much better for Nurgle to infect an entire planet with a ravenous plague that keeps them all at the brink of death, while their bodies slowly rot away around them for decades. One might think, however, that that might not be very nice, but it would be very effective. By the same coin, Tzeentch might have been happy with watching species slowly evolve to fit their environments, but again, boring. Much more interesting to touch them gently with a tendril of pure warp change energy and turn what was once a nice little bipedal human-like creature into a writhing mass of rolling, braying tentacles that chase sheep across the meadow. And Khorne, well, that one's rather self-explanatory, isn't it? It's the difference between calling somebody an asshole on the internet and going to their house and working their face over with a meat tenderizer. One would be considered to be well within the bounds of normal discourse on the internet, and the other might be considered to go perhaps a step too far. But, and this is a rather large African-American woman's butt, there is also other entities in the warp, isn't there? And since the entities are formed of the base emotions, their base interests, that means that they could actually be positive if those base emotions and interests are also positive. For example, Isha, the Eldar goddess of the harvest, fertility, life, healing, and growth. Those, unsurprisingly, are fairly positive traits, and of course this is one of the gods the Eldar created specifically because they wanted gods with positive traits that they could control, and forced them to utilize these powers to the benefits of the Eldar. Now in the case of Isha, she has currently been captured by Nurgle, which is a little bit of a problem, but hey, details. She is doing her very best to put up with the Grandfather, and also to whisper the cures to the various diseases that the Grandfather subjugates her to, so nice of her, I suppose. And lastly, Isha and the other Eldar gods prove that chaos can actually be a force for good as well, meaning that chaos in and of itself is not inherently evil. Again, I would far more compare the powers of chaos at its most base level, that being the warp and the immaterium, to a force of nature. However, that force of nature can be directed, both by humans and the creatures within the immaterium. And if one of these creatures gains enough power, they essentially become self-aware, which is what has happened with the 4 greater gods of chaos. And of course, once a creature becomes self-aware, it also becomes aware of the things that feed it. Just like a human understands that it needs food, a chaos god understands that it needs extreme emotions, and as such, obviously, it will attempt to feed itself the best way possible. Now, there, if you want to be semantic, you can also launch the counter-argument that is that truly evil? After all, this is a being, a life form, simply trying to survive. And if we are going to condemn Khorne for simply seeking out sustenance, would that not also mean that humans are evil for eating cows? And in all due reality, if you start going down further and further into semantics and details when it comes to good versus evil, you're going to find that there really is no such thing as good or evil. It's all subjective morality. Our morality would state that the actions of Khorne, drowning an entire planet in blood, would clearly be evil. But Khorne's subjective morality would be that it is delicious, and therefore not a problem. So in conclusion, no, chaos in and of itself is not inherently evil, but the chaos gods, yeah, as far as we're concerned, they probably are. Now, let's think about whether or not chaos can be used against chaos, shall we? Because this is an interesting question, because it's once again divided into two rather distinct subcategories. The first, of course, would be whether or not items, or relics, or artifacts, weapons, armor, etc. of the four Chaos Gods could be used against the four Chaos Gods. And then secondly, whether or not Chaos, the Warp and the Immaterium in general, could be used against the four Chaos Gods. And you might be wondering, hold on, isn't there also a third question? Could the power of the four gods be used against the Immaterium? But not really, because here's the thing. If one of the four Chaos Gods were to attack and destroy the Immaterium, that would be the same as exploding his own universe, and he would kill himself in the doing. Now, the Chaos Gods are not suicidal. In fact, it would appear that the very basis of their existence is self-preservation and self-growth. As such, I find it exceedingly unlikely that any one of them would ever think, hey, I want to blow up my own universe. However, that leads us into the final question. Can chaos be used to fight chaos? Now, originally, I thought I was going to talk about the Relictas chapter of Renegade Space Marines here, but I genuinely thought this would be a 20 minutes video tops, and it is not. And I don't want to relegate the Relictas to the last 10 minutes of a 40-odd minute video. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make next week's video on the Relictas, because they really do deserve a little bit of spotlight. They are a pretty cool chapter. But first, let's talk about the question, though, because while it will be, exemplified in the Relictas story, there is still a fair bit we can talk about in terms of chaos being used against chaos. Now, obviously, chaos artifacts can be used against chaos champions. There are several examples of this, and this is simply due to the fact that a chaos weapon is going to remain a weapon regardless of who you point it towards. It's not like it has a master recognition system or anything, where if you point it at a chaos champion, it's going to go, no, hurty massa. It's going to kill him just the same. Hell, Khorne is especially susceptible to this because, as we all know, Khorne does not care from whence the blood flows, just that it flows. In other words, a Space Marine champion might pick up a demonic blade, for example, and use that demon sword to chop the head of a Chaos champion. And there's really nothing particularly stopping him from doing this, except with a handful of exceptions. There are some demon swords who are so powerful that they can attack their master. The sword that Abaddon the Harmless uses, for example, would be an example of this, and frequently it lashes out against poor little Phaelbadon the Harmless. The rather interesting and quite potentially dangerous part comes thereafter. There's no inherent danger in using a chaotic weapon, or, well, there kind of is, because, as I mentioned, it might bite you, and it might even be so powerful as to instantaneously corrupt you. But if we look away from those two relatively fringe circumstances, there's nothing inherently dangerous in the short run, and that's the key, the short run. If you keep using a chaos weapon, however, it will almost inevitably corrupt the wielder, and this is true for all manners of chaotic artifacts. Literally anything that is infused with the power of chaos will, as a very base level, have that basic intelligence. Let me say it like this. Picking up a demonic sword, that demonic sword is going to be, in its own way, a minor demonic entity. And it is going to understand at a very basic and very instinctual level what feeds it, and as such it will do whatever is in its power to continue acquiring that fodder. This even holds true for chaos-infested books, for example. They will understand that it gains energy from rituals being carried out, and as such, it will try to influence the mind of the person using it to carry out more rituals, because it is in its self-interest. And over extended periods of time, this kind of subtle corruption is almost impossible to resist because it is very subtle. A radical inquisitor might pick up a chaos grimoire and use it at first with the purest of intentions to banish a demon, for example, but slowly but surely, and it might take decades, hell, it might even take centuries, it will worm its way into his soul and start rationalizing things. Oh, you used it that one time against a demon? Well, maybe this time you could use it again against another demon. It worked the first time, and maybe the next time you could use it against a minor demon, and maybe the next time it would provide invaluable insight into the mind of a cult leader, and so on and so on. It would keep finding ways of worming its way into the subject's mind and suggesting things. And there is virtually no way for the person to realize he's being manipulated in this way. It requires an absolute iron will every second of every day to resist this, because you have to resist not just the temptation to use it, but any and all temptations to even think about using it, because the moment you give so much as an inch, its claws will be buried thoroughly in your soul. And despite the fact that it might take centuries, it will drag you down eventually. And many of these chaos artifacts, well, let's just say it like this, it is well within their power to make you live for that long. And hell, that might even be part of the temptation. But Master, your great work is yet undone. You're an Inquisitor, yet you have not defeated chaos. But if you use me just this one time, I can give you the time you need. And so on and so on. Think of it from your own perspective. Think of it as if you were given a piece of temptation, something incredibly minor, every single day for the rest of your life. And you could never give in to even a single one of them. And it could be anything. It could be something so simple as giving you $100 when you needed it, or having the girl you like fall in love with you, or having you win the lottery and become a multi-millionaire. It could be everything. And this would happen every single day. Can you really say that you are 100% certain you would not at any point give in? I sure as hell can't. But then we finally come to the using it part. Now, of course, the previous argument is essentially the idea that utilizing a chaos artifact against chaos is going to be a self-defeating idea, because by using the chaos artifact, you are in all due likelihood going to spawn more chaos. Essentially, if you're going to be fighting a heretical fire with more heretical fire, odds are pretty good that at the end of the day, all you will really have done is create more fire. But at the same time, it is also true that the finest weapons to use against chaos are chaos weapons. Chaos champions have no resistance against these weapons like they do many mortal ones. Most chaos rituals will of course be written down in chaos grimoires, and if you know precisely what a cult leader has to do to accomplish a certain ritual, you will know precisely what you have to do to stop it. Additionally, many chaotic entities can of course be banned and even bound to the user's will through the usage of demonic rituals. These, of course, will, at the end of the day, almost certainly corrupt pretty much everyone. However, there is a further option, a third option, and that is the creation of an anti-chaos warp entity. Now, the Eldar have already started doing this with their creation of their very own God of the Dead, who is intended to be a weapon against chaos. Now, whether or not that will actually be successful will be interesting to see, because evidence already suggests that this god is not like the gods that the Eldar have created in the past. This one is not going to be quite so easy to control. We also have other supposed chaos gods like Malal. Malal is a rather insidious entity that's going to be getting a video eventually, but he appears to be an anti-chaos deity. He seems to wish to fight against chaos, And his idea is that the only way he can do this is by distancing himself from chaos so as to not be mistaken for it. He is playing the long game, and I think his eventual plan is to strike at chaos utilizing the various species of the galaxy and pretending himself to not be a chaos entity. And then, finally, of course, we have the third, and perhaps by far the most interesting option, that being, of course, Big E himself. Considering the sheer volume of worship that the Emperor receives, he has in all due likelihood become a warp entity in his own right. Now, this warp entity need not necessarily be the Emperor, and the Emperor may not necessarily be this warp entity. In fact, they could be two entirely separate beings, or they might not, because at the end of the day, nobody really knows what is and is not possible within the warp. We know it is affected by our world, there is nothing to suggest that an entity could not potentially exist within our world and their world if certain parameters were met, like, for example, I don't know, being near death while strapped to a device specifically meant to enhance your psychic powers? Who can say? Anyways, this warp entity would almost certainly be opposed directly and radically to the Chaos Gods, because that, after all, was the Emperor's end goal. He wished to eradicate chaos from the galaxy and put a final end to their threat against humanity. As such, any warp entity based upon the Emperor would have this as its primary directive and goal, and therefore its actions would primarily be organized around defeating chaos. Now, there is of course a small problem with this as well, namely the fact that to truly defeat chaos, you would have to basically mind control every last sentient creature in the galaxy. And as we have previously discussed, a Chaos God will always seek the most extreme solution because that is what gains it the most energy. Now, at the moment, I believe the Emperor as a warp entity is fairly weak. He can manifest some miracles here and there, and he can manifest some demonic entities, which have taken place on several occasions through 40k history. Emperor's angels, not the Astartes, but literal angels appearing and fighting off the foe. Indeed, some even suggest that the Legion of the Damned might be these Emperor's angels, and that is entirely possible as well. But it is entirely certain that at the moment he is not as powerful as the four main Chaos Gods. Therefore, his influence on the world is going to be very limited. He might want to mind control every last sentient creature in the galaxy, but he doesn't have the power to do so, and thusly he is going to go for the second best option. And in the case of Big E, that undoubtedly would be religion. He wishes to control what people can think, but he cannot do it directly. Well, the best way to do it then would be to influence the minds of a handful of people, a select few religious individuals, and have them preach the rules and regulations that the Emperor as a warp entity would like to see put into place. It's certainly not the speediest of plans, and it has taken 10,000 years just to get the cult of Emperor worship to the point where it is today, but the Emperor, being a warp entity in this case, is immortal. It has all the time in the world, and the only thing it is interested in is wiping out chaos. And a fanatical, loyal cult of Emperor worshippers, that seems like a pretty good way of doing it. So yes, on the third and final question, chaos can be used against chaos, both by mortals and in a more abstract sense, by creating gods to fight against them on a more, well, immaterial plane, I suppose. However, doing so comes with rather considerable dangers, to put it mildly, because whilst chaos might not be inherently evil, it will always seek out its own sustenance. And that means that even if an entity is benevolent and only wishes to wipe out chaos, well, as mentioned, the best way to do that would be to make sure that no creature in the galaxy could possibly be able to worship a chaos god. Now, if we're going to be generous, that would be mind control. If we're going to be less generous, then that might be reducing the entire galaxy to cold, dead, empty space. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.